Okay, the title of this message is the Laodicean Conundrum. The Laodicean Conundrum. And a conundrum is something that seems to go in two different ways that don't seem to match up. So we're going to look at the Laodicean Conundrum, and at the very end, see if there's a bit of a message for us as well. Revelation 3:16. Revelation 3:16. So then, this is to the angel of the Laodicean church and to the members. So then, because you are lukewarm, neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. Verse 17, because you say, I am rich, and I've become wealthy, and I love this expression, have need of nothing. Can you imagine? They said, we have need of nothing. We're hitting on all 8 cylinders spiritually. And you do not know. Here's what they do not know. You do not know that you're wretched, miserable. He's speaking spiritually. Poor, blind, and naked. I want to focus on the blind part most of this message. The blind part. So the question is, why don't they know that they're poor, miserable, and naked? Because they're spiritually blind. They don't really see what's going on. They have unknown apathy. And now here's the bad news for them. Verse 18, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich. Now, you're going to have to go through some hard times to force you to become spiritually hot. Buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, white garments, you may be clothed, and that the shame of your nakedness, because clothing is symbolic in an imagery sense of spiritual righteousness, the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed. Anoint your eyes with eye salve. In other words, your eyes are messed up. You can't see what you ought to be seeing. You cannot see. Anoint your eyes with eye salve that you may see. In other words, they are spiritually blind. Now, I want to make a point. If they were just lazy Christians, unmotivated, and they knew it, I don't really want to do anything. I kind of go through the motions, but I know I'm a lazy, messed up Christian. They wouldn't have been in the position of saying I have need of nothing. So they didn't. In other words, a person who is let's say, apathetic, unmotivated Christian, just barely hanging in there, they probably know it, or at least they fear it. They certainly wouldn't say, I have need of nothing. We're wonderful. Here's what probably existed. Before that letter from the Apostle John, which was obviously inspired by Christ, before that letter was delivered to the Laodicean church, if you had asked him, how do you rank among the churches of God in that whole part of the world, maybe the entire world, they would say, we are one of the best. We're one of the top ones. We have need of nothing. They were in a rich town, which wealth does tend to have a problem with being spiritual when you're in an affluent society. That's a potential danger for us. We might not think we're in an affluent society, but relative to most Christians in most history of the world, we're in an affluent society, an affluent society. They probably said, we're doing great. Then they got the letter from Christ, and the truth was revealed. Verse 19. And here's more of the bad news. This is the conundrum. They thought they were wonderful, then they got the message. See, what counts is not what we think, but what God knows, what Christ thinks. He's in charge of everything. And then Christ says, verse 19, as many as I love, I rebuke. It was like a parent. If you love a kid, you'll discipline him and chasten. Therefore, be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come to him and dine with him, and he will be with me. So he's saying that it's not too late. The door is not closed yet. Open your eyes and really see yourself. Don't be self-deceived, because we have to assume that they were self-deceived. Verse 21, to him who overcomes, I'll grant to sit with me on my throne. And so they obviously could overcome. They're going to be under pressure, but they can't overcome. sit down with my Father on his throne. So you can sit on Christ's throne next to him, figuratively at least. He who has an ear, let him hear. And that expression, who has an ear, let him hear. Since all of us have ears, they say this, the messages to all 7 churches are meant for all of us. There's something for everybody. In other words, there's a little bit of self-deception can exist. So if you have an ear, you should hear all these messages to the churches. And the one thing that I think we can get out of this the most, never, ever, never, ever, never, ever think you have need of nothing. I think it's like, I know I've heard coaches say this, and they would tell teams that, oh, you think we're the best, and you get complacent. As soon as you get that way, you're going to lose anyway. Or companies. By the way, they would say this about big industries, and sometimes medium size as well. If you're not growing, you're dying. You've gotten complacent. In other words, when your growth levels off, oh, well, we're level. That just means you're the next step away from declining. And one story I get to tell all my life is, I was working at Sears headquarters in Chicago. I remember there were discussions, I think it was 1971 or 2. Sears was the world's #1 retailer. And some little guy in Arkansas was starting some stuff. We'll get all the details, but if someone had told us that someday we would be bankrupt and they would dominate the marketplace, we would have been on the floor laughing. But I think less than 2 years, Sears had the biggest layoff in their management ever. And that was the year after I left. They had to think, so not that I had anything to do with it, but it looks good when I say it anyway. After I left, they started down. The only point is, the moment you think you're riding high, you could be not too far from falling. That's the point. Never, ever, ever think you have need of nothing. You can always improve. You can always find things that need to be. In other words, like one man said, sure, disasters happen, but you can prepare for them. He was talking about, this had to do with flood disasters and some related matters, but it could apply to financial disasters, market disasters. If you're really doing things well, you'll prepare for things that strengthen yourself, so if something does go wrong, you have a way to handle it. So all I was saying, never think you have need of nothing. Vanity can block your eyesight. I want to tell the story of Absalom. I'll just tell you the story, but you can read about it in the Bible. Absalom was the handsomest man and super charming, and David spoiled his boys and never wanted to believe anything bad about him. So he kind of stole the hearts of the people, had a little army, and got the chief general to join him, and they were marching on Jerusalem, and David didn't want to make Jerusalem a battle scene, a civil war, so he just kind of ran off with some of his mighty men and his small supporters. And his #1 advisor, used to be David's #1 advisor, he said, look, let me take 12,000 of our best soldiers and go after David tonight while he's still weary and still leaving. And once he's gone, you have no competition for the throne, you'll have it made. But David, it worked out this way. David was smart enough to tell one of his key advisors to stick in the capital and tell Absalom he was on his side, so you could counter the good advice that he knew that he would receive. And the advisor who was really working for David, he played to Absalom's vanity. He said, yeah, you could try that, but David is very clever. Remember all those years in the past where he escaped from Saul's army and something could go wrong. I advise you to wait a few months. Get a huge army from all over Israel. Then you can lead them yourself. Absalom's thinking of himself in a general's cape and big, gold armor breast and general, whatever, And you can just think of them and riding on a white mule, a white horse, I'm leading them. and I'll defeat my dad, famous David. When obviously, if you give David time, Absalom just a spoiled royal brat. What does he know about army? And David's a battle-hardened guy with all his mighty men. Well, you read about David and his mighty men. Matter of fact, Ahithophel, the advisor that gave him the advice, when he realized he rejected his advice and they were playing on his vanity, he realized he had backed a fool. And he actually committed suicide the next day. He didn't even wait for the results to be. He could see what was going to happen. And it worked out that way. David got a big army around him, and it was a rout like you'd expect. And it was the vanity that allowed Absalom to not see the obvious. It would have been obvious that David is very dangerous, and his mighty men, Abishai, all the ones that you've read about, Joab, you definitely don't want to take that risk, even if you have a bigger army. But the vanity got him. Now I want to give you an opposite example. This is a humble example of good spiritual eyesight. 1 Kings 3, 5, and 9. This is David's son Solomon. And Solomon had just taken over the kingship, and David had conquered all the nations all around. So it was peaceful and prosperous. So Solomon was inheriting a good situation. And God came to him in a vision. 1 Kings 3, 5. And the Lord appeared to Solomon. Ask, what shall I give you? And Solomon said, notice the wisdom of Solomon's answer. You have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, righteousness, and an uprightness of heart with you. David would never allow any idolatry. He loved God passionately. Verse 7. Now, O Lord my God, you've made your servant king instead of my father, and I am a little child. Now, he didn't mean he was a child. He probably was 21, but relatively speaking, 21 is pretty young to be ruling over a great nation like Israel. I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in. Verse 8. And your servant, meaning Solomon, is in the midst of your people, whom you've chosen, a great people. Therefore give your servant an understanding heart. Because he's asking for spiritual eyesight. He's asking for insight. He's asking for perception to perceive the way things really should be. You've chosen a great people. Therefore give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? That humility gave him great spiritual insight. He was one of the wisest men in the world, and much of his wisdom is in the book of Proverbs and some other parts of the Bible. And he was blessed greatly, and Israel's wealth and fame lasted for many years. Now, I'll admit, in his old age, he screwed up, but that's another story, which also proves the point that never think you've got it made. Even though he was wise, everything went well, many, many years. In his old age, it's another story. He made some key mistakes. But he did ask for spiritual insight. So in our prayers, maybe each person is individual. You might consider asking God to give you the spiritual insight that you might need, to see whatever you need to see, so that you can see it clearly. Because you can't always trust human nature. That's scripture, Jeremiah 79, the heart is desperately wicked, who can know it? People can self-deceive themselves. They do it all the time. I'm most wonderful, whatever they want to say about themselves. I'm the most greatest leader, and whatever they might say about themselves. I'm so pious. But if God were here telling them the actual evaluation, it might be a whole lot different. So ask for the spiritual eyesight. Ask for wisdom. And I believe if you ask for wisdom, God will give you wisdom. Don't be overconfident. That was the reason for the downfall of the Laodicean church. The more obedient you are to God, the more spiritual eyesight you will get. And good pushes you into better eyesight. Evil pushes you into more distorted eyesight and self-deception and lies. Just going to read a basic statement here about that sort of thing. It's John 8:44. And this is Christ talking in his day. John 8:44. And you are of your father the devil. Desires of your father you want to do. And what by the way, Christ is talking primarily to the spiritual leaders of his nation. You know, Pharisees, Sadducees, and some scribes and others. But he's talking to their spiritual leaders. He's actually calling them, you're being influenced by devils and you don't even know it. Because they probably, if you had asked at least many of those leaders, they said, we're the most pious. Obviously, they knew the Bible more than others. Because, by the way, in those days, the Bible was not available. Print did not exist. Scrolls were very expensive and only a few people owned them. They'd have to hear the Bible read at the temple now and then. But these men were, many of them, doctors of the law. That means doctors of studying the Bible. And, anyway, I'm going to all their credentials, but they knew the Bible quite well, and they thought they were pious and great. And Christ is saying, no, you're being influenced by the devil. And, of course, they were green with envy and jealousy over Christ. I imagine they thought in their own mind, well, if God were to send the Messiah to Israel, he would come through one of us, through one of our academies, one of our top guys, or, I'm sure that's what they thought. Christ, as far as they were concerned, came from the hill country, sort of like, and I mean this respectfully for people who might see this tape, from the Appalachian Mountains or the Ozark Mountains, this guy's way in the back in the hills of Galilee, out of nowhere. Here comes this guy out of nowhere, and he knows the Bible better than we do, and he's doing these miraculous works. They were green with envy. And he says about the devil, he was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth. The devil hates truth because there's no truth in him. As you watch the media spin lies and distortion, the more they do that, the more they're influenced by evil. Now, of course, I told this story about Vietnam a number of times, but it's worth just repeating. I was there at the Tet Offensive, and the Western Allies won the Tet Offensive like body count 10-1, and the others dragged their bodies, some of them across the border, so we hide the results. So it probably was worse than that. And the information was given to the American media, but the American media played it as if it was an absolute victory for the communists. And the communists, we know this from after the Soviet Union fell, all the documents were available, and they read the North Vietnamese documents. And they were getting ready, after the Tet Offensive, to make a deal with the Americans, sort of like the Korean War. I mean, you call that victory, but that was... But then they started reading the Western press and hearing people like Walter Cronkite tell them their defeat was a victory. And college campuses were rioting all over the place saying, ho, 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 Chi Minh. And I lived the era, so many of you are too young to remember it, but they did. And what that lie did was the war could have ended probably in 67, 68. It went on for another, I have to do my math in my head, another 5-6 years, depending on when the peace treaty would have been signed. Thousands more Americans died, and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese and others died. And after the communists took over, they killed, there are books written about it, they killed about 4 million people in that part of Southeast Asia. The worst of it was the killing fields in Cambodia. But the point I'm making at is that lie from the U.S. media cost millions of lives. Maybe that's the most spectacular lie I can think of. But they tell lies about everything, or they distort it, they twist it. And the devil is heavily influencing them. You can feel it. You can sense it. So truth is something the devil hates. And he's influencing even Hollywood movie stars that you love. They don't know anything. Just because they got pretty hair and they're a movie star doesn't mean they know anything. They're just doing the party line, whatever they tell them to do. I guess the most famous is Jane Fonda, anyway. For those old enough to remember her. Hanoi Jane. Sitting beside anti-aircraft guns shooting at American pilots. Anyway, because there's no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources. For he is a liar, the father of it. Verse 45. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. And they didn't want to hear any truth from Jesus of Nazareth. It just made, the more he told them the truth, the more things he did, the madder they got. He embarrassed them all the time. Like one of his several things he did, he even raised Lazarus from the dead on the Sabbath. He healed a guy that had been born blind, which had never been done before, because all that eye machinery, had never worked. And the guy saw just like that. And of course, the Pharisees plotted to murder him. And he told them in front of everybody, he said, think about it this way. You will circumcise a baby on the Sabbath. In other words, that's a lesser law than the Sabbath, to obey that law. And you're improving the baby's body a little bit by doing that. I'm making an entire man whole, doing the whole thing on the Sabbath. And of course, he did it just by speaking a few words. It wasn't like he did a great laborious job. And you say I'm wrong? Of course, they couldn't answer him back because his logic was too good. So they just like, oh. And the more he embarrassed them, the worse, the more they wanted to murder him. And every time they tried to murder him, it's interesting when you read it in the gospel, he would just disappear in the crowd. He could do that. How, I guess he looked enough like other Jewish men, and it was not God's will for him to die until he died when the Passover lamb died. I know we talked about that before, but it was just frustrating. We had him. We were around him, our police, and somehow he slipped away from us because he wasn't going to die until God would allow it. John 9:38. Then he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I come into this world, that those who do not see may see. So why is Christ here? So that we can have better spiritual eyesight. That those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. And when he said that, he's really talking to the spiritual leaders of the nation. He said, you all probably understand the certain things, and you all think that you see spiritually, but you're getting blinder and blinder. They thought they were spiritual superstars, but Christ said, no, you're blind. That's what he says. You're not spiritual superstars, you're blind. Can you imagine how they felt? I'm Pharisee Joe, and they had little things on their lapel and whatever they call them, of their ranking and whatever they did, but Christ criticized that too. They were showing off all their, I'm Pharisee of the highest order, and whatever. I went to so-and-so's academy, and we did this, or we gave to some charity. I'm sure they had various ways of puffing themselves up. And Christ says, not only are all these self-glorifying awards and self-deception you have, but you're actually getting blinder and blinder. It's the blind leading the blind. You can't see spiritually, and the people you're leading them off the cliff. Now I want to tell this stupid joke. This sort of makes a point, kind of, sort of. Probably most Americans won't understand this joke. It's an international joke, but those people who get to watch this in Britain and Australia, you'll understand it, I think. So on a talk show in England, someone says, well, what does it mean to be British anymore? Because Britain is declining. I mean, it's really... By the way, do you know the British, when they were thinking about maybe helping the Americans the Strait of Hormuz after the fighting was over, of course, they were going to send a British carrier and a French carrier, but the British didn't have a carrier. or at least not one that worked. They were going to borrow an aircraft carrier from Germany. I'm thinking about this. Wait a minute. Knowing the history of Britain, Britain ruled the waves. Until the latter part of World War II, they were the most powerful navy in the world. I think in the World War II, America eclipsed them. But even still, and by the way, it's Winston Churchill who invented the concept of the aircraft carrier when he was Lord of the Admiralty. And they rule the waves. And the British government is so weak now, they don't have even one aircraft carrier. If they wanted to launch it, actually they didn't. They kind of flimmed, they really weren't on our side. They couldn't do, anyway. I'm going to all that. And that makes them look even weaker. But they had to borrow one from Germany. I didn't even know the Germans had an aircraft carrier. I was shocked. What? They have nuclear subs, too. I didn't know they did that either. And they supposedly set the nuclear sub record, the Germans did. But the point is, what happened to British pride and British power? It's like, used to be Great Britain, now it's barely Britain, if that. And the Muslims are taking over, and I could say more bad things, but anyway, we will see. I'm hoping that with this Robinson fellow and Nigel Farage, Britain will make a comeback. We can only pray and hope. We will see. And Christianity may make a comeback in Britain. But what does it mean to be British on the talk show host? So people had different replies, but one man really hit the truth. He said, being British these days is like driving a German car to an Irish pub to drink Belgian beer and grabbing on the way Indian curry. And then when you get there, you sit on Swedish furniture and watch American TV shows on a Japanese TV set. And if you know all those things, they're actually true. There are tons of German cars in England. Anyway, Japanese TV sets, and they watch mostly American TV. And in other words, Britain has been hollowed out. It's false. I mean, that's kind of the joke of it all. But isn't that the position of the Laodicean church? It was all appearances, all surface, but underneath it was hollowed out. Also, America was going in that direction too. Maybe not as bad as England, but we were on that trajectory of being hollowed out. And everything we buy is made in China. I could elaborate, but you get the general idea. I think they're turning that around as they're bringing more factories back. And I guess we will see if it goes as they hope it will go, bringing more American-made stuff back here. But remember when John Deere made all the farm equipment and somewhere in the Midwest? Well, anyway, that's changed a lot. Hopefully it'll be coming back, although I've heard that John Deere may be going bankrupt. But anyway, don't worry about all the rumors you hear. We will see what actually happens. But that church was hollowed out. It was false. And what I want to just say as we move closer to the end of this message, the closer we walk with God, the more he'll lead us to good spiritual eyesight. The more spiritual fervor we have, the more he will lead us to good eyesight. And if you sacrifice to do things like go to the feast and come to church on a regular basis and pray every day and study the Bible every day and try to set a good example, that setting a good example is probably the hardest thing to do. It's easy, but as we get older, maybe it's getting harder to do stuff. But anyway, as you do those things, God will increase our spiritual eyesight. He really will. And I'm going to read verse 40. This is still John, verse 40. Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard the words that he said, about being blind. And they said, are we blind also? They didn't like that idea that he said that those who see may be made blind. We're big-time Pharisees. By the way, just so you'll know, the Sadducees were the more modern, liberal ones. They didn't believe in angels or miracles, and their belief in the Bible was what I call the secular side. Well, the Pharisees were the more religious ones. They believed in, at least they thought, everything in the Bible, and they were close to the Bible. They were strong conservatives. By the way, there is some evidence, and it's worth mentioning, that the synagogue that Jesus grew up in was a Pharisee synagogue. And you're going to say, well, how does that make sense? Actually, it does in one way. Who did Christ criticize the most? The Pharisees. Because the common people either were irreligious or they were with the Pharisees, and the upper classes were with the Sadducees, or the Sadducee ones. Well, since Christ was from a working class builder family, and that town probably same thing, it's more likely that they were more influenced by the Pharisees. And who do you criticize the most? The people that you know the best. I mean, if you think about that, it makes sense. You can say, well, so if he heard a lot of rabbis as he was growing up who were at least heavily influenced by the Pharisees, he would know them very well. So a lot of the bad things he said about them, he knew probably from deep experience, not just God's revelation. He knew it very well. And so they said, are we blind? And I want to make a point here. The Laodiceans were not totally cold. They saw enough to be held responsible by Christ. Remember, Christ said, I wish you were either cold or hot. If they were cold, he could just consider them non-believers, and they maybe get a chance in the second resurrection or something like that. But if they were hot, obviously they'd make it in the first resurrection. But they were neither of the two. So they knew enough to be held responsible. And I think Christ is implying that some of the religious leaders knew at least enough, because we knew Nicodemus was one of the Sanhedrin, and he came to Christ by night secretly, so he wasn't seen. He says, we know. Now, if you read it, it's in the book of John. Nicodemus said, we know. I look at that. We know that you are come from God because no one could do the things you're doing otherwise. In other words, many of them, maybe not all of them, but many of them knew the truth or feared the truth that this guy out of nowhere from Galilee really was, at best at least, a major prophet, if not the Messiah. In other words, they were not completely blind. In other words, just like the Laodiceans were responsible because they weren't, completely cold, he's telling the Pharisees, you're not completely blind to everything. And you're going to be responsible. And as we get close to the end of this message, I want to say, never think that you have need of nothing. That's the thing. Never think you have need of nothing. Stay humble. We can overrate ourselves, and that's easy to do. Oh, I'm one of the most pious, I like that, people in the world. And you can even say you're better than other churches. By the way, the more you say you're better than other churches, the more you may be mirroring what the Laodiceans said before they got the letter. So saying how great and wonderful you are proves nothing. It's what God says that counts. So never ever think you have need of nothing. That could be just a symbol of spiritual blindness. And then Christ, of course, gave them the truth. And once they heard him, of course, they realized they need to repent. Now, to the Pharisees, John 9:41, I want to read Christ's comments to the Pharisees who said to him, are we blind also? Here's what Christ said, John 9:41. Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. And actually, when you look at some other scriptures, he's threatening some of the Pharisees with committing the unpardonable sin. That's openly fighting and resisting God. Probably, and some did convert, we know from the book of Acts, join the church, but they were very religious. But the truth was staring them in the face. I think Christ was saying at minimum, stop persecuting me, stop lying about what I'm saying, stop accusing me of being inspired by Beelzebub. These were all things the Pharisees did. Because you all know better, or you ought to know better. And I think some of them did back off. But remember this, the Laodiceans believed before the letter arrived that they were the best church. And when you look at all seven, one church is dead. Maybe they're better than the dead church, but they're probably second worst on the bunch. Now their self-deception bubble has been burst when they got that letter from the Apostle John. All of us need to resist any bubble around us about how good we are, how pious we are, how, we're chugging along pretty good. We don't need any improvement. And we may not be apathetic, although you could be apathetic and don't realize it from God's perspective. Remember, the book of Revelation is written from Christ's perspective, not human perspective. But in closing, I would say, whatever our condition is, ask for more wisdom and push hard for the high calling that we have. Push hard for that high calling.